All right, everybody, we are back. It is Jack Murphy. This is the Jack Murphy Live podcast. You can find me, Jack Murphy, on YouTube at Jack Murphy Live, on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live, at the website jackmurphylive.com, Instagram, also Facebook. I planned it that way. Jack Murphy Live all over the internet. Welcome back. This is something I've been looking forward to, talking to Corey DeAngelis. How you doing, buddy? I'm going to give you an intro, but first tell me how you doing this morning.
I'm doing great. Today's a good day. It's a good week. It's a good month, really. Yeah.
It is. It is. There's always something good to find in your life, no matter what's going on in the world around us. Corey is the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation. He is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute and newly minted today, Forbes 30 under 30. Congratulations, Corey. Welcome to the show. I've been really wanting to talk to you for a long time, and we both know that's why, because you are the charter school expert. I am a charter school expert who has lived it many years, 10 years in the trenches. I was executive director of two different charter schools in Washington, D.C. Not only that, I was also the director of financial oversight for the District of Columbia Public Charter School Board. So I've regulated and run charter schools for a decade, and you, sir, are out there leading the charge. Welcome to Jack Murphy Live. Let's get into charter schools. First thing I want to know, though, my friend, is how did you get into charter schools? Why charter schools? Why school choice? How did you get here? You know, this is long form, free ranging, and I do love to know the context of my guests, opinions and ideas. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to be doing what you're doing today, Corey?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks so much for having me. I know we've been talking about this for a few months now, so I'm glad we finally set this up. We're actually pretty close, not too far away from each other. We could have probably done this in person, maybe next time.
Definitely.
But yeah, I just want to start out with how I define school choice for the audience really quickly, because that could include charter schools, but could include things like private school voucher programs and education savings accounts. But the easiest way to think about school choice is funding the student instead of the institution. So it's allowing the students' education dollars to follow them to wherever they're getting an education. And that could be the traditional public school that the student is residentially assigned to, which is how it works in most traditional school systems in the United States. But if that doesn't work for the student for whatever reason, they would be able to take their education dollars to a private school, a charter school, or a homeschool option, such as a micro school or what people are now calling pandemic pods. So that's the easiest way to think about what school choice is. And I always like to point out as well that we already fund other taxpayer-funded initiatives this way when it comes to higher education. For example, we had the Pell Grant for low-income students and the GI Bill for veterans. The money goes to the student, and the student can choose a public or private university of their choosing. They don't have to take that money to the nearest community college, for example, that happens to be run by the government. Same thing with pre-K programs. Before you get to kindergarten, a lot of these programs, the money generally goes to the family, and then the family has a choice, a public or private provider of a pre-K program. This is even the case when we look at things like the federal Head Start program. And you can keep going on and on and on with these types of examples. The one that I like to point out most often is the food stamp. With food stamps, we don't residentially assign low-income families to government-run grocery stores and then force them to spend that money at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. I think most people, whether you support food stamps or do not support food stamps, I think most people can agree that it would be absolutely ridiculous to force people to spend that money at one particular institution that happens to be run by the government. With the reality is families rightfully get that money and are able to choose. They can take it to Walmart, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, or just about any other provider of the service. All I'm arguing when I talk about school choice is that we should structure K through 12 education funding the same way. And what's also really interesting here is that a lot of the same people who support funding people directly when it comes to things like Pell Grants or pre-K, when it comes to higher education and before K through 12, all of a sudden don't support it when it comes to the in-between years, when it comes to K through 12 education. And I think the only reason that I can come up with as to why this may be the case is that the power dynamics differ. when it comes to higher education in pre-K and with grocery stores, the norm is that people already have a high degree of choice. The norm in K through 12 education is that there's this entrenched special interest that profits off of getting your children's education dollars, regardless of whether you're even sending your child there and regardless of whether the family is satisfied with the product that is being delivered. But to get to the more specific question that's the special interest that I'm referring to. But you asked how I got into school choice, and really quickly on that, I actually attended a magnet school where I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I went to government-run schools all through K through 12 in San Antonio, Texas. So if I mess up during this conversation, it's because of my government school education. But in high school, I was able to attend a magnet school, which is still run by the district, but at least you're not residentially assigned to a magnet school. You can pick. And I felt like that made a big difference on my trajectory. And then also I started studying economics at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where it really started to click a lot, where the main problem with K through 12 education is this geographic monopoly that traditional public schools have, where you're residentially assigned to a particular school, so they don't have any particularly strong incentive to cater to the needs of individual families, especially when you combine that with, one, the power of the teachers unions, but two, the compulsory funding structure through the property tax system. So that kind of opened my mind on school choice.
Right.
If you want me to define charter schools, I can as well.
Yeah, please go for it. Charter schools are my, in my bailiwick, and I would like to hear what you have to say about it. And then I got a lot of stories.
Yeah, a lot of people are confused about what's the difference between, so like I put it out pretty easily. School choice is just funding the student. You could take that wherever it is, a private charter. But what's the difference between private charter and public? The formal definition of a charter school from the U.S. Department of Education and every state Department of Education that I've seen is that it is a public school by definition, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because charter schools are kind of, in my view, a halfway point between a public school or a government-run school and a private school, because charter schools are privately run or managed, but they are publicly funded and highly publicly regulated, and they cannot charge tuition. They generally cannot have a religious affiliation and have any religious education services, so they're public in that sense. But they are privately run, which is why I kind of call them like a quasi-public private.
Privately
that's the basic
owned
idea.
And operated and publicly funded is the way that I always described it. And so I get a little upset when I hear politicians either ignorantly or willfully saying that charter schools siphon money away from public schools. No, sir.
That's the number one myth in my recent book, co-edited volume with the Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey, School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Yeah, people will say that school choice or charter schools siphon money from the public schools, to which I respond, well, one, charter schools are public schools, but two, school choice doesn't siphon away money from public schools. Public schools siphon away money from families, and school choice initiatives just return that money to the rightful owners. You could still take that money to the public school, but the money doesn't belong to the public school in the first place. It doesn't belong to the charter or private school either. It's meant for the child. It should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. Education funding isn't. Yeah, go ahead.
It happens like that in tradition. So what I like to use is say traditional public school versus charter public school. So in the traditional public school system, even at the county level, they're still budgeting per pupil. They're still sending money to whatever high school has more kids than this one over here has fewer kids. And so this idea of a per pupil funding mechanism is not new. It's not novel. It's not stealing money from traditional public schools. In fact, the whole point here, right, is that we've now introduced the concept of competition. Right?
Exactly. And when it comes, and you're absolutely right that schools are already funded based on enrollment counts. So when I move from one state to another, or if I move from one district to another and buy another house to be assigned to a better traditional public school, the school I leave loses the same amount of funding. The fiscal impact is the same as if I were to switch to a charter school or a private school, whether I'm using a voucher or paying out of pocket, the financial impact's the same. So why does it become such a big deal when low income families are starting to be able to have access to alternative options? The reality is advantaged families are already more likely to have access to school choice. They can already afford to be in a neighborhood that's residentially assigned to the best traditional public schools, and they can already afford to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. School choice, in that sense, is an equalizer by allowing less advantaged families to access alternatives. So it's weird that all these arguments start to come out only when disadvantaged families are starting to get access to alternatives.
Isn't that weird? Isn't that weird? Here in Washington, D.C., which has one of the most robust and highly developed charter school markets in the United States of America, it was where charter schools were piloted back in the 90s. I think it was Bob Barr and Mother Guy from Georgia. They wanted to introduce, which is an extreme, is definitely a right-wing public policy experiment where we introduce competition into what was ordinarily provided as a public good and with a monopoly. And now we've introduced competition with the idea that we're going to create better schools for our kids, right? And in Washington, D.C., this was seen as a civil rights matter. Because in D.C., the schools on the, quote, wrong side of the river were underperforming, and they had scores that were very low and just poorly managed and poorly operated. And then the schools on the right side of the river, on Northwest Washington, the public schools there, the traditional ones, were doing quite well. And they thought, hey, we need to solve this racial disparity in education opportunities by introducing competition and allowing these students and these families in DC, it's Ward 7 and 8 across the river, Anacostia Southeast, give them an opportunity to go to any school that they wanted to within the district and have a choice for specialty type schools or trade schools or bilingual education or art or performing art schools, etc. And so it's odd to me that in Washington, D.C., it's seen as a civil rights issue. But then nationally, this is like what comes down to some sort of weird right-wing conspiracy. I don't know how you.
Well, I mean, even across the country, the families that disproportionately benefit from using public charter schools tend to be higher percentages of minority students, and then higher percentages of low-income students as well. The National Center for Education Statistics has data on this, which I could share with you after the conversation. We can put into the show notes, but charter schools have higher proportions of disadvantaged communities. The same thing when you look at private school choice programs as well. DC also has a private school choice program that Biden's policy playbook that was put together by the National Education Association actually calls to get rid of the DC voucher program. The average household income of the families using the DC voucher program is only around $27,000, which is pretty low, especially considering DC is a high cost of living area. And the racial demographic composition of students using the program in the most recent year, about 95% of students using the DC voucher program are identified as Black or Hispanic students. And the latest experiment on the DC voucher program, comparing the students who won the lottery to attend a private school in DC versus the ones that lost the lottery and had to go back into the public school system, they didn't find any difference in math or reading test scores after 3 years of using the program, but they did it at a third of the cost. The voucher amount is only around $9,000 or $10,000 per student in DC, but they also found large positive effects on safety, satisfaction, and attendance. So the program seemed to be working, especially when you look at non-test score outcomes, which when you ask families why they're choosing one school over another, a lot of the things that they most often list is the safety of their students, the culture of the school, whether they feel like their student is being included in the conversations, and that's what the evidence bears out as well.
Which they're clearly not in a traditional public school setting in Washington, D.C., which the schools were falling apart, crime-ridden, terrible scores, bad and poor investment. And so I just wonder who and how did this conversation get hijacked, right? Because when I worked at the DC Public Charter School Board as Senior Director of Finance, which means I was in charge of regulating, I think it was $800 million worth of charter school income and revenue at that time. You know, there's 50 or 60 charter schools, over 100 campuses in DC. And what struck me was that this is a right-wing public policy experiment in that it's competition, right? It's libertarian oriented, let's say. But then all the people that are staffed up within the charter school board at the public charter school board in DC and other charter schools are very hardcore progressive leaning leftists, to the point where when Trump was elected back 4 years ago, they had, therapists in there and there were people crying and whatever, but they didn't understand that Trump and Betsy DeVos, they were charter school advocates, and that they were going to do everything they could to help with school choice. And yet at the same time, they didn't want to see that happen. And now they're voting for Biden. And Biden is coming out and saying very clearly that he is going to come after school choice. So tell me about that contradiction in your experience, and then just tell me how you see Biden dealing with the upcoming, if he is inaugurated. Tell me how that's going to work out with charter schools and school choice.
Yeah, I mean, historically, school choice, as you said, has been a bipartisan issue or a nonpartisan issue. Look at the first, or at least the first modern day private school voucher program in Milwaukee. It was a bipartisan effort pushed by Paul E. Williams, a Democrat, because people understood on the right that it was a market-based, competitive, competition-based reform. But then people on the left saw that, this is an equalizer. And it helps the least advantaged more than anyone else in society. And so everybody kind of came together to understand that school choice is good for everyone. And then more recently, though, if you look at the state legislatures, for example, Ohio is the most recent state that expanded school choice. Just like a week or two ago, the governor signed a bill expanding the income threshold by 25% for their voucher program. But every single Democrat in their state legislature voted against it, and most of the Republicans voted for it, so it passed. But there were a few defectors from the Republican side that voted against it. But yeah, I mean, if Biden is elected as president, he's already talked about the thing, or at least his policy director has talked about what will happen. The biggest threat to charter schools would be to pull away federal funding of charter schools. I will say federal funding is only about 8 or 9% of total per pupil expenditures in the United States. But, for a charter school that's already getting less than what the traditional public school is getting in the same town on a per pupil basis, that could be the marginal amount of money that could cause them to go out of business. And so Biden's policy director just a couple weeks ago just did an interview with the Education Writers Association, where they pointed out that they were planning to take away federal funding from all for-profit charter schools, which is only about 10% of all charter schools, 10 to 12% of all charter schools, which even in that case, the charter schools themselves aren't for-profit. They're managed by for-profit entities, which is a little bit different. So that would take away a lot of funding from those charter schools, which is only about a tenth or a little bit more than that, which I don't have a problem with for-profit charter schools, just to be clear with the audience, because I don't have a problem with profit if it's made through voluntary selections. If you're profiting from providing students with a good service, that's a great thing. What I am not okay with is people profiting off of a system where they're compelling their customers to attend their schools. And that is the traditional public school system. That is not the charter school system. When you have choice, the profit motive is a great thing. When you have compulsion, the profit motive is a terrible thing. And so there's a big difference there. But then also the policy director in that interview stated a couple of other things where they said that they were going to take away all federal funding from charter schools that don't, quote unquote, provide results. And that just makes me worried about how they're going to define results. Is it just average test scores? If that's the case, you might harm the charter schools, or at least disincentivize them for serving the least advantaged students. But then also families don't only care about standardized test scores. They care about things like safety as well. So you could be forcing parents into less safe institutions just based on these test score outcomes. But then also, I don't even think it'll be based on results. If you look at what's happened recently, for example, in West Virginia, just a couple of days ago, the first charter school that applied to open in the state of West Virginia Academy, was just blocked by the Board of Education. It's essentially like McDonald's getting to decide whether a Wendy's is allowed to open up in a nearby location. It's a clear conflict of interest. And in Buffalo, New York, just this year, the state Board of Regents just decided to they took a vote to close down one of the highest ranking public charter schools in the Buffalo area. So they cited things like, it's about funding. Yeah, it's about protecting the monopoly. It's not about the needs of students, which is a problem.
So much to respond to there as a charter school leader and regulator. I'll tell you, on the federal funding side, budgets are already very strained in charter school world. Why? Because you're trying to do the most that you can do for your students with the resources that you have. So you're literally spending as much of the money as you can, unless you're also building a reserve for safety, right? But then you're spending as much money on programs to deliver the best results for the students possible. So you're already operating, on a thin, very thin line when it comes to your budget. And you take away 10% from federal funding, and that is a really big difference. And I remember all the time that we spent applying for Title I funding and E-rate funding and other tech funding in order to just deliver services to the students. I think it would be really important. Now on the same similar thing that you mentioned in terms of the accountability, right? So the whole idea of charter schools is that you get autonomy for accountability. Now, what kind of accountability are we looking at? And I was never a fan of using top line test scores as the way to measure how well a school is doing, because all really the top line number of school testing shows is, what are the inputs into your school? What are the students already bringing into the school with them? Mother's education level, what was life like at home for them? Are there two parents in the household? Did their older siblings go to college? What are the expectations? That is what the top line level is about. The way that you measure the quality of a charter school, or any school in my mind, is how far do you move the student from the time they enter your school building to the time that you leave. So you need to be focused on growth, not on top line numbers, because as we've seen, and this might be a little spicy, as we've seen all across the country, urban, rural, red state, blue state, the test score distribution is relatively consistent. And there's a number of reasons that go into that, but it's not necessarily because of the teachers or the curriculum. So what we want to see is how far can we move a kid? Can we move? I remember as running a high school, we would have kids come in on like a 4th grade reading level, right? So if we take a kid from a 4th grade reading level to a 9th grade reading level in 1 year, but he's a 10th grader, what do we get out of that? Well, it looks like we failed, but instead, actually, the truth is we've done an incredible job. And so the accountability measure that I would like to advocate, and I'd like for you to advocate if you can, is not the top line test scores. Nope. Is the growth. How do you move a student from the time you engage with them first to the time that they depart from you? And now, are you seeing anything like that out there?
Yeah, I definitely think growth is a much better form of accountability measure from the top down. But I think the only true form of accountability that we have in any industry, including K through 12 education, is bottom up accountability. If your school isn't providing for you, I can take my child's education dollars elsewhere. Same thing with any other industry. But I definitely do agree. If we're going to have some form of top down accountability, it needs to be based on growth, because otherwise, with just levels, you're just reflecting the background characteristics of your students, which is a horrible way to do it. So I think we could agree there. And then I also wanted to hit on my latest report out of the University of Arkansas. We looked at 18 major metropolitan areas, including Washington, D.C., and we found that across these 18 areas, students in charter schools tended to get only about 2/3 of the amount of funding as the students in the traditional public schools. So when you see studies that claim that charter schools do no better than traditional public schools, which isn't the true outlook of the charter school evidence, it actually tends to be slightly positive when it comes to test scores. But even then, even if you found no difference, they're doing it at a fraction of the cost. And my latest study found that that's about 2/3 of the cost, which is a lot more bang for a lot fewer bucks, which is a big thing to point out. I also wanted to point out one more thing from that policy director interview from Joe Biden's team, is that he said or she, I believe that her name was Steph Feldman. She said on one hand, the charter schools that don't provide results will lose their federal funding. But then one of the reporters asked later on in the interview, well, what about the traditional public schools that don't provide results? Actually, well, they just don't have the resources. They just need more money.
Right.
So in the same interview, that difference in outlook between the two sectors, differences in standards and just really just showing what team they're on is just so obvious. Like on the one hand, charter schools that don't provide results, we're going to take all their money away. But the traditional schools that don't provide results, they just need more money, even though they already get more money than the charter schools.
Well, not to mention they get more money, but there's also the school bus support. There's also security and police support. There's also facility support. There's also all kinds of other things that aren't even really captured that traditional public schools can benefit from that charter schools do not. So let's ask the real question, Corey. Are these people just stupid, or are they actually evil? And maybe there's a gray area. I don't
like the question motives or intelligence. So I'm just going to say they just don't know any better.
Yeah.
But you can't forget, if you look at the contributions from the teachers unions, about 99% of them go to the Democratic Party. So there is a bit of incentives in there to listen to what the teachers unions want. And if you look at what the teachers unions are overwhelmingly calling for, is they want to eliminate their competition. And you can see it in the NEA's policy proposal playbook for the Biden administration. They're calling for a lot of the stuff that Biden's policy director was calling for, and a lot of the things that are actually included in the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force document. They're calling to get rid of the DC voucher program for low-income and minority students. They're calling to regulate the crap out of charter schools. They're calling to defund charter schools. It's just all a protection of the monopoly. And like I said a second ago, I don't like to question motives or whether you're a good or bad person, but there is an incentive structure that's set up in the current system to prevent people from escaping to another alternative. So there's that.
Very good libertarian perspective to leave it all up to incentives. You're absolutely right. The structure there does incentivize certain behaviors, but I know you're not going to say it, Corey, but I'm going to say it because I've been there and I've seen it and I know what it's about and I know what the teachers unions are about. They are deliberately trying to kill their competition because charter schools are not traditionally unionized. They don't want to have to deal with charter schools that don't pay scale. And why don't they pay scale? Because teachers are willing to come take less money to work there because they want to work in the inner cities, or they want to work in a dynamic charter school that's trying new things or that's being successful or as part of a national network of charter schools. Hey, maybe this teacher thinks it's best for them to get a job with a charter school network that has a school in Washington, D.C., maybe some schools in New York, maybe some in Dallas and California too, so that they can have upward mobility, so they can have a career. These are people making informed choices, and the Democrats are in bed with the teachers unions. The teachers unions want to kill charter schools. Therefore, the Democrats are going to try to kill charter schools, even though everyone involved in charter schools understands that it's a civil rights matter that is meant to equalize education opportunities irrespective of the property values and where your student lives. And so the absurdity and the hypocrisy in all of this is just sickening to me. It's maddening. I am furious. This is my old industry. I know where all the warts are. I know where all the bodies are buried. And it's pretty gross, actually. But one thing before we get back, I just want one thing in there. You said it best when you said that bottom-up accountability is what we should be depending on. And what that means in realistic terms is parents make choices. They vote with their feet. So they decide this school is a good school. I want my kid to go to school there, so I'm sending my kid there. That's a vote. Now, what can we do to make that process easier and more beneficial for parents? Transparency. Transparency on test results, on teacher qualifications, on the curriculum, on safety numbers, on suspension expulsion numbers, on free and reduced lunch numbers, on any kind of metric possible. We need to be shining as much light as we can on all of the schools so that parents can make an informed choice, and then we can use the parents' decision as a way to judge whether or not a school should be open. It reminds me, if you have a legal dispute, I've been through family court, and when you have a dispute with your ex-wife or whatever, the judge says, just mediate this. Whatever you two can figure out best for your kid is better than whatever the court is going to decide. So they want you to work it out on your own. We should want parents to work it out on their own, where they get to send their kids, because only they know what is best for their children. And so I strongly advocate for full transparency on test scores, on every other metric possible, so that parents can make the best decisions, and then we just trust what the parents are deciding.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I wanted to point out that I thought it was interesting that Joe Biden, during his campaign, his official campaign website did not mention the word charter schools. It didn't mention the word school choice. And I think the reason for that was because he had a conundrum on his hands. He knew that on the one hand, if he came out for school choice, the teachers unions would have came after him. And if he would have come out against school choice, a lot of his constituents that would normally vote for him, who benefit directly from school choice, either through voucher programs or through charter schools, would have had an issue with that as well. So the best way for him to kind of go forward with that was to just not say anything about it, even though there were interviews that came out where he said, if I'm president, Betsy DeVos's whole notions from charter schools to this are gone. And then he's had other interviews with the NEA and teachers union saying similar things that were negative about charter schools. I thought was super interesting. And it would make him look like a hypocrite to come out against school choice too. He went to private schools and sent his kids to private schools. Why isn't it okay for other people to send their children to private schools?
He is clearly a hypocrite. He's going to appoint. Has he nominated or suggested someone for?
Yep.
Who's that?
Yep. So this wasn't directly from the Biden campaign itself, but there were two separate stories, one in the Washington Post and one from Politico, separately released at a similar time, saying that this information came from conversations with close people in the Biden administration. And they both listed three top people. One of the people said that they weren't going to do it. That was Linda Darling Hammond, affiliated with Stanford University. She said, I'm not going to do it. The remaining two people were closely affiliated with teachers unions. One of them was Randy Weingarten, the current president of the American Federation for Teachers, which has 1.7 million members, the second largest teachers union in the U.S. The other person is Lily Eskelsen Garcia, who was the president of the largest teachers union in the U.S., the NEA, who Joe Biden's wife is also a member of that group. So the two remaining people that are the top, who are still in the running, are very closely tied to the teachers unions, and that doesn't look good for families. It looks good for the establishment and the status quo, but it doesn't look good for school choice going forward.
That literally put a pit in my stomach to think Randy Weingarten would get to be head of department ed. That makes me kind of ill, actually, thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of these people who say that public schools, school choice, or charter schools defund public schools, and she calls charter schools private schools. But then at the same time, she likes to use this other talking point where she says that, 90% of kids are in public schools. Well, that's only true if you count charters as public schools. So she classifies it differently depending on what she's trying to argue. If she's trying to say it's privatization, she'll call them private schools. But if she's trying to boost up her stats to say that more people are in the public school system, she'll count charters as public. But what's interesting with that argument too is that just because 90% of people are trapped in a particular system doesn't mean 90% of people would be in there if they were given a true choice. Right. And all the surveys that I've seen on this, there's been at least two that have come out this year, national surveys, nationally representative surveys, finding that fewer than half of that proportion would actually be in traditional public schools if the families were given a true choice. A lot more people would be in private and homeschool options if the funding followed the student instead of the institution.
In Washington, D.C., we have about 50-50 between traditional public and charter school population. And that number had been growing for a while, and then it sort of stabilized. And it's interesting, too, that the scores actually have also equalized. The results are almost the same, which brings, up another question altogether, is what is the general efficacy of the public school system? What are they actually doing for our kids? Are they actually moving anybody in any direction? And that's something that's a conversation that we really need to have. Now, I'm just going to go on a little bit of a rant here. School outcomes are a system based. It is not just the school. It's not just a teacher. It is not just one factor. It is history. It is geography. It is public policy. It is criminal law. It is prison policy. It is mother education levels. It is reading in the home. It is two-parent households. All the reasons and things that incentivize or disincentivize family creation, etc. All these things have a factor in student outcomes. It is not simply the teachers or the curriculum or the testing. And so when I see this huge focus on how do we just throw money at schools in order to make the test scores better, I know that is a mistake, because I know that that's not what is actually driving test scores. And then when I see, here's some of the sausage I saw, okay? I sat in a room at the DC Public Charter School Board, and I watched all of the key, what do they call them? Not constituents, but whatever, the people that they need to talk to, right? Stakeholders. All the key stakeholders were in the room, and they were talking about the PMF, which is the Performance Management Framework, aka the scorecard they give schools, right? And the schools were upset because if you had a higher number of at-risk kids or low-income kids or minority students, your test scores were lower than if you had a school full of upper middle class affluent children in there. And they wanted to change the tool and hide this discrepancy in there so that they weren't being the actual test scores themselves weren't being revealed. There was less transparency, and they're trying to hide the achievement gap, which has been difficult to close over time. There was a time period at which it closed, and then it stopped closing starting around the 90s, and it's been relatively consistent since then. And so we're obfuscating, we're hiding, and then we decide to say we need just more money, but not for charters, for traditional public schools, so that they can hire more people and line their pockets, and the unions. But the worst part is the professional service providers, that ecosystem around the public schools, professional development, textbook sales, curriculum development, tech stuff, computer systems, software systems, student data systems, et cetera, et cetera. That's where the money goes. It goes in, and who runs those things? Former teachers, former teacher union people, former people in the administrations. It's just, I'm getting crazy.
We do see a lot of administrative bloat over time, so we shouldn't expect throwing more money into the system to change the results if it hasn't done so historically. If you look at the per pupil education expenditures in the U.S. on the K through 12 level, we've increased them in real terms by 280%. It's nearly a quadrupling since 1960. That number has increased by, it's nearly doubled since 1980 and increased by about 40% since 1990. So we throw more and more money into the system, even after adjusting for inflation, and we get similar results over time. More money doesn't matter if you don't have a strong incentive to spend that money wisely. And I mean, just look at the results from the voucher programs that are only funded at a fraction of amount of the traditional public schools, and look at the charter schools that get a lot less money than the traditional public schools, yet you have millions of families flocking to the charter school system despite those schools getting less money on a per pupil basis. If it was about money, you'd see the families saying, oh no, I don't want to go to those schools, they're not well funded. But the reality is you can spend $100,000 per student and get the same results if you don't change the incentives baked into the system to spend the money on what matters, which is in the classroom, on the teachers, and on the students. If you just look at the latest data from 2000 to 2017, the student enrollment went up in the US by about 7%. The number of teachers went up by about the same percent, by about 8%. But the number of administrators went up by over 10 times the amount of students. about 80% or 75 to 80% higher. So we throw more and more support staff and administrators into the system, which is good for teachers' unions because they get more political power through more people in their voting block, and then also more union dues for the union bosses. But that's not good for individual teachers, because when you look over time, teacher salaries actually remain much more stagnant than the amount of money being thrown into the system. So when you hear teachers saying like, oh, I gotta, I'm not seeing any of the money, the schools are underfunded, I'm having to pay for supplies out of pocket, I kind of feel bad for some of them, because it's kind of true when you look at the spending patterns over time. The teachers aren't seeing it, but that's because of the monopoly power. It's not because of their competition. In fact, there are 5 studies that link school choice competition through charters or private schools on public school teacher salaries. All 5 of the studies that I've seen on the topic find that the public school teachers start to make more money as a result of competition, because the leaders of the public schools start to say, oh man, I'm going to lose my talent to these competitors. And we're going to lose students as well to our competitors if we don't start to spend the money wisely. So they start to allocate more of the resources to the teachers. So school choice is good for students, but it's also good for teachers at the same time. But it might not be good for administrators and the teachers' unions.
Exactly. And we've also seen that same administrative bloat, that disgusting overhang of overhead and just bureaucracy and waste in the university levels as well, which is, I think, drives almost all of the increase in tuition, in college tuition. If you look at the chart, you can see the number of teachers is like this, the number of administrators is like that, and then tuition is like that as well. And so you're not paying for more teachers, you're not paying for more resources, you're paying for more, especially at the college level, more Title IX officers, cramming diversity, equity, inclusion crap down your throat, bias response teams, kangaroo courts prosecuting kids for making bad off-color jokes and things like that. So it's a huge waste. And then you add in the federally subsidized student loan market, and there you go. You've got this huge absolute cluster F, which is just one of the most disgusting and horrifying things facing our nation today.
I mean, you hinted at political indoctrination at the university system. Just wait till you see what goes on in the K through 12 system. But this is another great argument for school choice and bottom-up accountability, that you can be residentially assigned to a public school that has great test scores, but you could be feeling like your student is getting indoctrinated based on different politics of the teachers in the system, and you may still want to choose to send your child elsewhere. And even if you have a school that's a quote unquote high performing or good school, families should still have that option to choose based on these other things, such as political indoctrination. And I think a lot of conservatives have started to wake up with this remote learning thing, because they started to see what's going on in the classroom, and a lot of them aren't liking it. And we're seeing a mass exodus from the traditional public school system this year. The latest data from Gallup estimates that we'll see about a 7 percentage point decrease in the proportion of students in traditional public schools, which would turn out to be about a 3.5 million student exodus. I've seen this in every state that's released official data as well. For example, in New York, their latest data suggests that about 4% of students are leaving the traditional public school system. That could be partially because of the political indoctrination, but it's also probably because the families they need some type of in-person instruction at a private school, or maybe the charter schools are more likely to do it in their area, or maybe they really like the homeschooling that they're doing, especially since the Zoom learning just isn't working out through the public school.
What a fascinating piece of irony there, that if this democratically pushed lockdown corona nonsense also happens to be the disrupting factor that helps sort of realign education in America. We have a long way to go before that's the case, but it is interesting to see 7-8% withdrawal out of traditional public schools. Couldn't happen to a better guy. It couldn't happen more quickly in my mind. But you did bring up something that's worth talking about. We've got 2 more big buckets I want to get to here. First one is critical race theory in the K to 12. What are you seeing? What have you heard? What are the issues that have been coming up? And then after that, we're going to talk about corona and reopening. So let's talk about the critical race theory.
Yeah, I'm not big on the critical race theory stuff and how that's going on in schools. I do know that the 1619 projects, for example, was implemented in at least 5 major school systems. The last time I checked, I think it was implemented into the curriculum in DC, Buffalo, New York, and 3 other major school systems. So, I mean, look, this is just another good argument for school choice, though, that if you shouldn't be forced to send your child to a institution that you believe is indoctrinating your child, and you shouldn't have to pay for that. You should be able to have the education dollars follow your child to a different institution where they're getting the type of education you want. And it might not even be the topic that's being discussed that's the issue for a lot of families. It might be just how it's being discussed. So, conversations about race could be a good thing to learn about in schools. Sure. Some families may say, okay, let's just stick to math and reading. Let's do that kind of conversation in the household and in the community. But even with families who may think that it's a good place for it to happen in the schools, they may think that the teachers are just giving one side of the conversation. And I think that's another issue when it comes to these kind of sensitive topics.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's common practice and has been in schools forever to discuss current events, right? I remember that when I was a kid, and I used to love it. Current events was fun. It was stuff that was in the news. It was timely, whatever. It was worth talking about. Problem is today is that critical race theory in and of itself is not necessarily just an unbiased frame by which to analyze current events. And in fact, it has in its core the activism and the change element and the embedded assumption that all white people are racist and all black people are victims. And so that those elements cannot be changed. And when you see them popping up in our publicly funded traditional public schools by principals and school boards and whatever that may or may not know exactly what they're doing, right? Like, you got to hand it to the people, the race pimping CRT folks, because I think that they have hoodwinked a good number of people, right? You're like, Black Lives Matter. Sure, Black Lives Matter, of course. We should probably talk about race. All right, let's talk about race. Oh, you have a thing on how to talk about race? All right, sweet. We can talk about race. Things like courageous conversations. It's so cloaked in this, fake name, but really built into it is, telling white kids that they have to sit with their racism, and that if they're uncomfortable, they're supposed to be, and you better sit there and take it. And you need to understand that the final goal of critical race theory is, quote, for white people to yield positions of color we yield positions of power to people of color. That's the end goal. It's stated, it's written right in the literature. Parents just don't know that. Mm-hmm. And so when I see my kids happen to my kids in Montgomery County, where they just send home this information, they send home, please read White Fragility, please read Anti-Racist. It's like,
they're banning a lot of books in other school districts. I don't know if you saw it in Burbank, California. They just banned 5 books, including Huckleberry Finn, and a couple of others that I didn't think were all that complicated. But right, people disagree on these types of topics. I mean, a lot of people probably think that the 5 books that were banned shouldn't have been banned. But hey, at the same time, if there were parents that weren't okay with Huckleberry Finn, I'm okay with them choosing as well. They should be able to go to a school that doesn't have this kind of stuff. And maybe you're in an area where you think that there's too much conservative stuff going on in the classroom. That usually isn't what I see in the media when we see political indoctrination claims spreading on social media. But if that were to happen, I'd be all for that too. That we shouldn't force our views on other people, whether that's left, right, or any other way.
Indeed. And kudos to you, sir. You are on message. You are on message, my friend. I love it. You're absolutely right. It's all about choice. It's your money, people. It's your money. And there's no reason that you should be compelled to go to the school that's nearest to you just because. Like, what good reason? Now, I understand where this comes from, right? Like, way long ago in your little town, you built the school and everybody in the town paid for it. So everybody went. But that system, like almost all of our political economy systems, all of our institutional systems, all of them were meant for a much smaller scale. And they were not intended to be applied at this level. And they were not intended to have a federal layer on top of it that issues commandments and edicts from Washington, D.C. that reach out through the power of money into countrysides and small towns across the country where people don't even care or want to think about Washington, D.C. in the least, but yet all the way down into that small group in third grade for that one kid, his instruction is being affected by somebody 3,000 miles away who doesn't give a crap about him. So we need to focus on getting a new system, and charter schools are one step in the direction of figuring out. I mean, God, if there is anything that should be decentralized, it should be freaking education, right? I mean, come on.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why the government needs to run the schools. There's no reason why people need to be residentially assigned to particular schools. For the same reason that government doesn't need to run the grocery stores, government doesn't need to assign you to a particular grocery store. There's no public good argument to be made for schools. There's an argument that there's a public benefit through positive externalities of having an educated populace, but that doesn't have to occur in a government-run institution. It can occur even more effectively in a private institution. There's a public benefit of being well-fed too, but that doesn't mean the government needs to fund groceries for everybody. And it doesn't mean that government needs to run all of the grocery institutions either. And look, we have education that is privately produced at the higher education level and the pre-K level. And with K through 12, we already have a private market for education. We should just expand that opportunity to other populations that currently cannot afford to do so. And change how we fund education. And you did point out that people are thinking a little bit differently about the school system. And the latest data I have on that is from the Real Clear Opinion Research. Since April, the support for school choice mechanisms has jumped by 10 percentage points from 67% to 77%. And I think it's because people are realizing that there's no good reason to fund the institutions when, one, they're not even opening, and two, when you can instead fund the students directly. And I think we're seeing that clear now more than ever, that families are not, they're getting the short end of the stick. They're getting a bad deal when it comes to K through 12 education. They're seeing that because their schools aren't even opening, and the schools are getting to keep their children's education dollars. Meanwhile, families are scrambling, trying to figure it out and having to pay out of pocket for private school expenses or to pay for the expenses that are associated with in-person childcare. And so families are seeing that they're getting a bad deal here, and they're waking up.
So many important issues were hidden, ignored, forgotten, or lied about in this whole anti-Donald Trump nonsense of the last 4 years. What could be more important than having control and choice of where and when your own child is educated and by whom? What could be more important than that? And instead, nobody is talking about that. That wasn't a big issue on the campaign. Nobody on the Democratic side is asking about that. No one seems to care that Betsy DeVos was actually looking out for our own students and trying to give you, the parent, the choice. Who is against parents making choices for their own children?
The monopoly.
The monopoly, right? But no one in their right mind, right, is against that. And so now, just because Betsy was appointed by Trump, she's the devil, right? And then now,
she is a billionaire. That must mean she's
right. It means she's
does bad
stupid.
things.
She's stupid and does bad things, right? Right, of course. And then now they're going to put in somebody in the Department of Education who's going to be bad for kids, and nobody seems to care. This is one more little rant here. This is a prime example of how the Democrats gaslit and abused their own party, their own voters, into acting against their own interest, to voting someone in who's going to screw with their kids. I don't understand it. I don't get it. It's sad. It's one of the most terrible things that has happened in these last 4 years, the way that this anti-Trump mania put children on the back seat. It put children in the corner. Nobody wanted to talk about children. Nobody wanted to talk about education. They just want to talk about how Donald Trump was a bad guy. And now they voted out the bad guy. But guess what? They let in somebody who's going to not do the right thing for their children. End of rant. Let's move on to the last subject here.
Yep.
Last subject is COVID and the teachers unions. Tell me, catch me up to speed. I believe
we could spend another
schools,
hour on this topic. Oh my goodness.
I believe all the schools should be open. How do we get the schools open, and are the teachers union in the way?
Yeah, I think you're right on having the schools open. At first, when this debate started, I was kind of I don't know what the data says yet. I'm going to hold off and let the district, call for allowing districts to choose, but then allowing families to choose at the same time. That was how I started looking at this. But now more and more and more and more data have come out to suggest that the children in the schools are not contributing significantly to the overall community spread. And you have other businesses that are open that are more risky than the schools should be one of the first things that are allowed to reopen. But we didn't see that. We saw so many groups fighting, teachers unions fighting against the schools reopening. And just to hit on some of the data that have come out recently, Rand Paul has been saying this all along. I just want to point out, because he pointed to the studies from Sweden and other countries where the schools and the children were not significant contributors of the spread. But we also had the United Nations, UNICEF, put out a report just a week or two ago for data from 191 different countries suggesting no consistent link between the school reopenings and the spread of the virus. We had Anthony
191?
Fauci.
Just
191 countries. Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Anthony Fauci just said it yesterday that the spread among children and from children tend to be not really big at all. And what he means is pretty much very close to zero when it comes to children. He said to close the bars and open the schools. We had Cuomo just a couple of weeks ago on a news segment point out that we're not seeing spread in the schools. You see a very low percentage of positivity in the schools. De Blasio admitted this in October. He said consistently what we're finding is no evidence of spread in the schools. When he closed the schools just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Chancellor of Schools, the New York City Chancellor of Schools, admitted in that press release that these schools are remarkably safe and that the positivity rate was only 0.19% in the schools, whereas the overall community positivity rate was over 10 times that amount, 3%. So look, there's tons of data suggesting this is the case. One more data point is from Brown University's Emily Oster. She's also finding this as well consistently across the country, that the schools are experiencing much lower positivity rate for the students than the overall community, suggesting that it might be a good idea to open the schools if we're looking at the science. But like I hinted at a second ago, is we've seen teachers unions fighting to remain closed. And this is rational. It's arguably rational from a cost benefit decision-making standpoint, at least in the short run, because they can keep their benefits around the same in terms of job security and pay, and then reduce their costs as much as possible in terms of in-person childcare responsibilities, commute times to work, and then also they might be able to cut down on remote instruction and any risk of the virus whatsoever, even though the risk is already low. So from just a basic cost benefit decision-making standpoint, it makes sense for them to argue to keep the schools closed. And again, I'm not saying that they're bad people. It's just that they're rationally responding to the messed up incentives that we have baked into this monopoly system. You didn't see any of this from the grocery stores or from the private schools. In fact, you saw the private schools fighting against governments that were shutting them down. For example, in Sacramento County in California, you had a private school that rebranded itself by retraining all of its employees as childcare workers because the daycares were okay, but if they were doing the learning thing, it all of a sudden wasn't okay. And so they got around that. They tried to get around that ridiculous regulation by rebranding themselves. So we didn't see the public schools doing that. And I think the difference is, again, that the private sector has been fighting to reopen, whereas the public schools have been fighting to remain closed. And that's because one of these sectors gets your money regardless of whether they even reopen their doors this year. And I can keep going with examples of things that have happened. Fairfax Education Association lobbied to keep schools closed until August 2021. They actually started a petition recently. That'll be a year and a half of closed schools. We saw the teachers unions including in their call to demand for safe schools political things such as defunding the police and having police-free schools and having Medicare for all, and to ban their charter school competition and to ban new private school choice programs. We saw a lot of politics entering these conversations and power dynamics instead of safety. And there have been 3 studies on the topic. I've done one of them myself at Social Science Research Network, finding that places that have stronger teachers unions are significantly less likely to reopen their schools for in-person instruction, which isn't a surprising takeaway. If they have more sway, they're more likely to get what they want. What are they calling for? They're calling for to keep the schools closed. And if we had school choice, none of this would be an issue, because I'm of the thought that the district should have the choice whether to reopen the schools or not. Every single district should have that choice. Teachers should have the choice whether to return to work or not for in-person instruction. But we need to extend that logic all the way down to the families. The families need a choice too. And the only way that we're going to do that is to fund the students directly instead of the institution. That way, if a school chooses a virtual reopening and that works for families, take your money back to that school. That's fine. I think families should have that choice. But if not, you should be able to take that money elsewhere. And I mean, look at the way that I like to think about it is, if your grocery store doesn't reopen, I looked at the grocery store outside my window. If your grocery store doesn't reopen, you can take your money elsewhere, even if you're using food stamps. If your child's local school doesn't reopen, you should be able to take your children's education dollars elsewhere. And that's the main problem here.
Indeed. Everyone has a choice in the matter except for the parents.
Yep. And that's the main problem here. And look, I don't have a problem with the unions themselves. The problem is the union power coupled with the uneven power dynamic that's created through residential assignment and forcing people to go to their institutions. If the union lobbied for a crappy curriculum in my school and I could take my money elsewhere, it's like, okay, well, at least they'd have an incentive to change. The problem is the union exists and fights against that funding mechanism to have the funding follow the child. So it's kind of I would like to allow them to exist, right? But the problem is they have a strong incentive to lobby to get rid of that bottom-up accountability by forcing the families to go to their institutions. So it's both of these things that cause problems.
Every time I try to pull you off message and to get you to say something antagonistic, you go back. You're very good, highly professional. Well done on that. So I will take the time. The GD teachers unions are killing our children, period. That is the end of the story. The teachers do not want to come back to work. They live an hour sometimes away from the school in a cheaper place to live, and then they commute in and get that big city teaching money. My dog's barking at the postman if you can hear it. Get that big city teaching money and take it back to, an hour and a half away, and now they don't even have to drive in, and they can teach from home. And some of them aren't even teaching. They're just recording videos and putting them up and letting the students filter in, and it's just a video of them there. The teachers unions are keeping the schools closed. Even the districts want to open them in some cases, but they don't have the staff because the teachers union won't let the teachers come back to work.
That happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They planned to reopen in person. It happened in the Phoenix area in Arizona. And most recently, it happened in Scottsdale Unified. They had to close the schools on a Sunday night. This happened in Scottsdale and in Kenosha. They sent out an email to parents hours before they were supposed to send their child for in-person instruction, telling them, oh, well, we're having attendance issues. But another thing is what you said a second ago, and is the title of this podcast, is about lives lost of children. I was wondering if you had seen the study in JAMA. It's a medical association journal. They actually estimated the years of lives lost associated with schools closures during the pandemic. And I'm just going to read the finding really quickly.
Yes, please.
This decision analytical model found that missed instruction during 2020 could be associated with an estimated 5.53 million years of life lost. This loss in life expectancy was likely to be greater than would have been observed if leaving primary schools open had led to an expansion of the first wave of the pandemic. So I didn't know if you were alluding to that study, but there's a legit scientific published study suggesting that.
I was half pulling it out of my butt, but that is actual real data and a real study and real analysis. And it's clear as day to anyone who has any children who have kids struggling with virtual school. Not only are Fs and Ds and failing grades on the rise all around the country, even in Fairfax County, Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland, two of the highest performing school systems in all of America, two of the richest counties in all of America. More kids are failing than ever before. My son, I love him to death. He's had straight A's his whole entire life, and he just all of a sudden now having problems with virtual school. Kids, no socializing, inability to be around each other, inability to learn how to communicate and play games and exercise. I bet you we're going to see an uptick in childhood obesity because kids don't have recess anymore, and their parents are working. I got a couple more minutes to go.
Yeah.
The childhood obesity is going up. Grades are down. Anxiety is up. Depression is up. Suicide is up. Friendships are down. Socialization is down. All because the teachers' unions will not come back to work. Period. I know Corey won't say it. I will say it. It's okay. Corey's excellent, on point, on message, very professional. I am just Jack Murphy Live Renegade. I can say whatever I want. And I'm putting it right square on them. If it wasn't for the teachers' unions, we'd have the schools open again, and kids would be healthier, they'd be happier, and our entire country would be wealthier and better for it.
Well, and it gets worse than that. Have you heard of
all? It gets worse.
Well, yeah, you say they're not returning to work, but it gets worse than that. Have you heard of the school districts all across the country that are not reopening their schools because it's not safe? They say is not safe because they can't do it for in-person instruction, but they're opening the same school buildings as daycare centers. Right. And then they're charging families out of pocket in addition to what the families are already paying through the property tax system, which is essentially a form of extortion. Yes. Just imagine if a private school did that. They said, oh, well, we're not going to give you your $15,000 in tuition back, but actually we will open our doors if you give us another $15,000, but we're not going to give you that initial payment back, even though we told you that we were going to provide a certain in-person environment for you. So it's a form of extortion. We saw this in so many school districts, and I was starting to think about this. Why would they have to pay? Why would families have to pay twice if they're already paying for the property tax system? And so when I dug into this a little deeper, I started to see that the school districts were still paying the teachers, but the teachers were staying home and providing virtual instructions to the in-person learning environments in the classroom. There were other people that were willing to come into the school buildings from the private sector that were more than willing to provide the in-person childcare duties. And so what happened was families were having to start to pay twice for the same services just because the teachers were refusing to go into work. And so they had to pay two people for the price of one, which, hey, that's great for the employees in the private and the public sector, but it's horrible for families that had to pay twice because of that uneven power dynamic. And look, I mean, the only way to fix this is to give families their money back. Let them take that money elsewhere so that they don't have to deal with all of this nonsense. I mean, in Fairfax too, we saw other nonsense. They were paying bus drivers to drive around town to practice, even though the schools weren't open and they weren't driving any students around in the buses. Right. They were just
insane.
Paying the adults.
I will say it, you won't say it. Ban the teachers' unions. There is no reason to have teachers' unions looking out for the teachers and teachers' unions when the whole point is to help our children. Our children should be the ones that come first. If you are a teacher who's refusing to go back to work, then I think that you should not be allowed to shop at a grocery store where the people in the meatpacking plants and the people stocking those shelves and the people running those cash registers have decided that it was worth it to them because they didn't have a choice.
Well, yeah,
they want to help you, and they're there. They're essential. Are our teachers essential?
Yeah, teachers are essential, and we should treat them like they're essential. But I mean, it's so obvious to most people. Like, you look at all of these other sectors fighting to reopen, where the public schools are fighting for the opposite in so many, not all of them, but in so many places. And if you look at the data overall from Brown University, the private schools are indeed, it's not just anecdotal evidence, are indeed much more likely to open than the traditional public schools in the surrounding area. And it's all about incentives. Look, yep. if you had to give your grocery store the same amount of money each week, regardless of whether they even open their doors, they'd say, oh, well, the service that we're providing you is the groceries, so we'll just mail it to you, and you should be happy with that. That's what the teachers are saying right now, that, we're just, our service is professional education. We're doing that over the computer. And so even though it's not really as good as in-person instruction for so many families, you could have heard the grocery stores doing that, but they understand that if they did do that, if Walmart did that, for example, they would understand that a lot of families would say, oh, nope, I want to see my produce in person. I'm going to go to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods.
All right, Corey, this has been fantastic. I can totally rant on about a million issues about education forever. It's great to have another expert to talk about it. You are extremely well educated and up to date on every element around your subject area. So kudos to you on that. Congratulations on being named 30 under 30 for Forbes. Amazing resume already at this point. Had I known you were so young, I don't know if I'd brought you on the show. I'm just kidding, guys. I, too, was precocious once when I was younger. So congratulations, Corey. And in sum, everybody, charter schools are public schools. They do not siphon money away from public schools. They incite competition where a monopoly once reigned. We don't allow monopolies most of the time because we know they're bad for the consumer. And in this case, the consumers are children. Why would we let a monopoly dominate something that impacts our children so importantly and so tremendously? And in this case, in such a negative way. Reopen the schools, in my opinion, ban the teachers' unions. Time for a Reagan-Patco moment on them. Let's get rid of the teachers' unions. Oh my God, if Randy Weingarten becomes the director or secretary of education, I don't know what's going to happen then. But again, school choice will solve so many of these problems. Corey, I know you got to go, brother. Thank you so much. Big day for him. He's all over the news today. Thank you for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it. Anything else you want to say in sum?
I wish we could talk for another hour, but I just want to point out really quickly that charter schools don't steal money from public schools. You would similarly never hear someone say that allowing families to choose their grocery store steals money from Safeway. The money doesn't belong to Safeway. The money doesn't belong to the public schools. It doesn't belong to the private schools either. It belongs to the child. Education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not propping up and protecting a government monopoly. We should have our education funding reflect that reality and our priorities, which is supposed to be the child, not the institution and the teachers unions. So thank you so much for having me, and let's fund students instead of institutions.
Indeed. Everybody follow Corey DeAngelis on Twitter. Track him down. Is there anything else that you'd like to get out right now? You said you got the book. What else should people look for?
Yeah, available on Amazon now, School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. This is co-edited with Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey. I think it's actually on sale right now if you want to go check it out. But we have a lot of great authors that contributed to this volume in addition to me and Neil McCluskey. So go check it out.
Awesome. Follow me on Jack Murphy Live on Twitter. Hit subscribe. Smash that like button, set the reminder, the notification bell. Got to do the YouTube bit. Audio listeners, please subscribe on whatever podcast software you're listening to. That does help. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for all the support. Corey, thanks for coming on the show. And we'll be back next week with another guest and another interview. Thanks, everybody.